profesor Angelo Bottone prefiere exponerlo en el atril. Le presento brevemente. El profesor Angelo Bottone enseña filosofía en el University College de Dublín y en la Dublin Business School, y es investigador dentro de la Fundación Newman. Hizo su tesis doctoral en filosofía en el University College de Dublín. Su tesis doctoral fue precisamente sobre la idea de la persona humana en los escritos de Newman, los escritos concretamente dublineses. Ha publicado recientemente 2 libros sobre Newman y Wittgenstein, y el hábito filosófico de la mente, retórica y persona en los escritos dublineses de John Henry Newman, en inglés, todavía no traducidos, y diversos artículos sobre filosofía de la religión, Paul Ricoeur, etc. Sin más, le doy la palabra al profesor Angelo Bottone.
Thank you for your kind invitation and for your introduction. The relationship between knowledge and morality is a theme, one to which Newman devoted much of his care. A man with a deep ethical sense and incisive intellect would be expected to argue for a convergence of education and morals. This expectation is especially understandable if we bear in mind that most of his educational writings were written with the view of establishing a Catholic university in Dublin. It's not surprising, therefore, that he perplexed his contemporary readers when firmly stated that liberal education as an object distant from virtue, and that the end of university education is intellectual, not moral or religious. He said, knowledge is one thing, virtue is another. Liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. Now, this is a very delicate position that requires extensive explanation, and this is what I'm going to do today. Was not Newman's educational project aiming at training good Catholics? What was his conception of the gentleman? Is the gentleman the model of the human person that Newman had in mind when he was elaborating his Dublin writings? I'll try to address those questions. The distinction between virtue and knowledge is an issue that Newman treated in a series of letters later collected in his essay, The Tamworth Reading Room. And this series of letters were occasioned by a public speech that a politician called Robert Peel, who was also prime minister for a while, a series of lectures, a lecture that he gave at the opening of a library in the city of Tamworth. In this speech, he outlined what Newman perceived as the proclamation of utilitarianism as the official educational philosophy of the British state. So Peel's program was to raise the ethical tone in society through education, according to the principle that in becoming wiser, a man will become better. So wise, educated men are also morally better. Newman, in his essay, refuted Peel's arguments, defending the opposite thesis, that secular knowledge without personal religion could not assure the moral improvement of society. Intellectual study alone was not sufficient to train the moral character of the masses. And so after 10 years from this lecture, in The Idea of a University, he defended again the distinction between moral and intellectual virtues. Newman has no doubt that the end of the university is intellectual culture, and it must be employed in the education of the intellect. In The Idea of a University, he says, a university, taking its bare idea and before we view it as an instrument of the church, has this object and this mission. He contemplates neither moral impression nor mechanical production. He professes to exercise the mind neither in art nor in duty. Its function is intellectual culture. Here it might leave its scholars, and it has done its work when it's done as much as this. In affirming that liberal education has an object distinct from virtue, Newman found himself between two strong oppositions. On one side, some politicians claiming that education had to replace religion in the formation of a public moral conscience. Similarly, but for opposite reasons, some Catholics, especially the Bishop of Dublin, wanted education to sustain religion in the formation of a public moral conscience. Both they were interested in learning all insofar as it ministered to something. In one case, ministered to the public utility, in the other case, to religious utility. Newman put forward the thesis that the end of a university education is intellectual and not moral or religious. But before its publication, he received harsh criticism from some of his own fellow oratorians who maintained that the end of a Catholic university is to make good Catholics. So he was compelled, in order to not to disappoint the expectations of his friends and the Catholic hierarchy, to write an introduction in which he clearly distinguished between the direct end of a university, which is the cultivation of the mind, and the indirect effects, which are also moral and religious. This is a key distinction, and somehow it's an Aristotelian distinction. As I will try to illustrate in the following pages, Newman's position was rather complex. In order to understand him, we must clearly distinguish between direct and indirect ends, their consequences, and also whether he's considering a university as such or the specific case of the Catholic University in Ireland. Now, Newman clearly affirms that the object of liberal education is nothing more than intellectual excellence. Following Aristotle, he specifies that everything has its own perfection in the scale of things, and the perfection of one is not the perfection of another. He says there is a physical duty and a moral. There's a beauty of the person, there's a beauty of our moral being, which is natural virtue, and in like manner, there's a beauty, there is a perfection of the intellect. All those subjects are distinct, and aesthetics, morality, and knowledge have their own fields and their own scale of values. To open the mind, to correct it, to refine it, to enable it to know and to digest, master, rule, and use its knowledge, to give it power over our faculties, application, flexibility, method, critical exactness, sagacity, resource, address, eloquent expression is an object as intelligible as the cultivation of virtue, while at the same time it is absolutely distinct from it. Newman, in these pages, recalls the plain failure of professors who have attempted to make man virtuous, assuming that refinement of mind was virtue. Educated men, we know this very well, are not self-evidently the virtuous portion of mankind. So every political project aiming at to the formation of a public moral conscience exclusively through education is fated to fail. Newman said, from the time that Athens was the university of the world, what has philosophy taught man but to promise without practicing and to aspire without attaining? Now, it's not a paradox that the greatest apologist of the philosophical habit of mind was also extremely critical of knowledge as a source of virtue. In order to consider the real drive of this position, we should bear in mind that these remarks were made in the chapter where he defends the thesis that knowledge is its own end. And in this chapter, his purpose is to prove that the distance that separates knowledge from utility is the same as the distance that separates knowledge from morality. His treatment of the two relationships runs in a parallel and follows the same structure of reasoning. As knowledge must be pursued for itself, and utility will follow in due course, so positive consequences for morality will also follow from intellectual activity pursued for itself. Newman claims the autonomy not of morals, but the autonomy of knowledge, being at the same time anti-utilitarian and anti-moralistic, while despising neither utility nor virtue. And in confronting these two aspects, no Victorian was better suited to talk about morality and education than he, rich with his own Oxford experience, and also as a religious leader of educated people. And I think it is because of his deep sense, moral sense, and long familiarity with human nature that he distrusts their fragility. Moreover, his views appear clearer if we bear in mind that these passages in these passages he was considering the direct ends, not the effects, but the direct ends of university education. Newman recognizes that the cultivation of the intellect, even if it has an object distant from morality, has moral effects on the individual and in turn moral effects also on society. So in the idea of a university, he presents some of these effects of the ethical character that the cultivated intellect will form. He firstly affirms that liberal knowledge rescues man from the fearful subjection to senses, which is his ordinary state. So intellectual employments occupy the mind with noble objects, and whatever their content is, they do a work which is materially good as long as they expel, this is what he says, they expel the excitements of sense by the introduction of those of the intellect. So they replace vulgar objects with noble objects of investigation. Our moral constitution is so weak that we need some expedient that it's congenial and it helps us in improving our moral character and also to take us away from temptations. A second influence, which Newman claims an intellectual has on our moral nature, is the tendency to refine the mind, giving the mind a disgust and abhorrence towards the excesses and enormities of evil. Newman says that a cultivated mind feels scorn and hatred for some kind of vice, and even if the mind cannot mend the art after bad action have been committed, it does at least give birth to an intense remorse that will prevent from future sins. So here, Newman is depicting a balanced mixture of moral and intellectual virtues that are incarnate in the noble figure of the gentleman. And this is what I'm going to address now. What was his portrait of the gentleman? When Newman talks about the gentleman, he's concerned with the traits of the ethical character that the cultivated intellect will form. He deals not with the end of education, which is the liberal mind, but with its consequences on the character of the learner or the scholar. The traits of a gentleman personality, his attitudes towards life and towards others in society, are marvelously presented in this celebrated portrait of the gentleman. And I have selected some lines. You can read it on your own. It's a long quotation, but he portrays a gentleman wonderfully. What it has to be clarified that in Newman's description of the gentleman, there's no mention of money, status, or privilege or power. These are not the constitutive elements in Newman ideal. His point is resolutely ethical and intellectual. It's not sociological. in this phenomenology of the gentleman, it is difficult to distinguish between ethical, aesthetics, and intellectual characteristics. They all appear interrelated and balanced in this noble figure who seems almost an incarnation of the perfect man. It's not surprising that many readers have taken Newman's sketch as a model of human being, given its capacity of fascination and attraction. Newman depicts the gentleman with such a dedication that we tend to forget that this charming figure is presented only to be soon dismissed and rejected. This is the paradox. So his positive characteristics are somehow exaggerated on purpose. And we are easily confused if we read those passages out of context. The context being a discussion of the limits of intellectual culture when it's cultivated outside of religious principles. In the portrait of the gentleman, he also devotes some lines on the religiosity of the gentleman. So I'm going to read some lines, not everything, but you find it on the handout. He says, if he be an unbeliever, he will be too profound and large-minded to ridicule religion or to act against it. He's too wise to be a dogmatist or a fanatic in his infidelity. He respects piety and devotion. He even supports institutions as venerable, beautiful, or useful, to which he does not assent. He honors the ministers of religion, and it contents him to decline its mysteries without assailing or denouncing them. He is a friend of religious toleration, and that not only because his philosophy had taught him to look in all forms of faith with an impartial eye, but also from the gentleness and effeminacy of feeling which is the attendant on civilization, and so on and so on. Now, there's no sign of condemnation in those lines. Criticism is postponed, and disapproval will become evident soon. But for the moment, here Newman aims only to show the best of this fascinating character. And sometimes when he's describing the gentleman, it seems that this is also a kind of self-portrait. He's presenting himself. He says, he might be right or wrong in his opinions, but he's too clear-headed to be unjust. He's as simple as is forcible, as brief as is decisive. Nowhere shall we find greater candor, consideration, indulgence. He throws himself into the minds of his opponents. He accounts for their mistakes. He knows the weakness of human reason as well as its strengths, its province and its limits. Don't we see here Newman himself in the intent of understanding his opponents? Some scholars have compared this description of the gentleman with a portrait of St. Philip Neri that Newman presents somewhere else. Both those portraits are similar in style, and both occur at analogous position in the final part of the discourses, which is the first part of the idea of the university. Ian Kerr, who is probably the most important contemporary scholar in Newman, wrote, "This is not to suggest that the gentleman and the saint are the same. No. On the contrary, the two types differ greatly. Indeed, the tension between the gentleman and the saint is between the generally unconditional insistence on the absolute value of knowledge in itself, on one side, and equally firm conviction that knowledge is emphatically not the highest good. And this opposition stands at the center of the idea of a university." So is the gentleman the model of human person that Newman had in his mind when he was elaborating his educational project? My answer is no, in the sense that he was more than the gentleman. So according to the interpretation I'm proposing, the gentleman was not the positive ideal of a man, even if the characteristics of the gentleman might be included in this ideal. Moreover, because Newman's model of human completeness contemplates virtues that can be reached only with the help of divine grace and therefore only through Christian life, a liberal education on its own falls short of producing his ideal. Talking about his Irish project, in the preface of the idea of a university, Newman says, "Our desideratum is not the manners and the habits of gentlemen. These can be and are acquired in various ways, by good society, foreign travel, by innate grace, dignity of the Catholic mind. But the force, the steadiness, the comprehensiveness, and the versatility of intellect, the command over our own powers, the instinctive just estimate of things as they pass before us, which sometimes indeed is a natural gift, but commonly is not gained without much effort into the exercise of years. This is real cultivation of mind. I do not deny that the characteristics, excellences of a gentleman are included in it. Certainly, a liberal education does manifest itself in courtesy, propriety, polished words, action, which is beautiful in itself and acceptable to others, but it does much more. How shall we explain this sudden change of thoughts? Ian Kerr writes, throughout the idea of a university, there is a perpetual element of suspense, as evaluations are constantly modified by the author's changing point of view. So Newman moves, and with this movement also his perspective moves. But the most remarkable and dramatic shift, Kerr says, the most dramatic shift of perspective in the discourses is to be found in its most famous part, the celebrated portrait of the gentleman. So Newman, in this portrait, adopts an almost paradoxical rhetorical strategy. He demonstrates the limits of intellectual excellence in order to promote a higher form of excellence. So the gentleman is Newman's portrait of the limitation of intellectual cultivation, quite as much as an evocation of its benefits. The gentleman is at the same time both the best product of liberal secular education, but also an imperfect model of humanity, at least when compared to that which a Christian education will lead. So it's precisely in this moment, as we admire the qualities of the gentleman, that Newman asserts that even the most excellent liberal education by itself falls short of making the Christian. And we should not forget that this famous portrait of the gentleman is presented not at the beginning of his book, The Idea of the University, as an example to imitate, but it's presented nearly at the end of the book to contrast this portrait with the highest ideal that combines intellectual proficiency and religious piety. So we can be easily confused by Newman dialectical movements of thoughts that affirms and then he denies. He portrays so magnificently and then he dismisses with the same vigor. Indeed, the strategy is also useful in illustrating that the gentleman who appears as an object of temptation is someone we might admire, but whom we must not indulge. Newman had an ambivalent towards classical education. We see it when he talks about Cicero, for instance, but also had an ambivalence towards great thinkers of writers like Gibbon, the historian, or Goethe, for instance. They are sometimes presented in good light as examples of excellence, and sometimes as dangerous foes, enemies. Newman scholar, maintains that these ambivalent attitudes towards culture reproduce a conflict that was central in Newman's educational experience. In fact, since his adolescence, Newman was struggling between his intellectual aspirations and his sense that this knowledge was somehow dangerous and forbidden. And I'm talking about pagan, heathen knowledge. And I believe that we don't need to hypothesize as a kind of schizophrenic character to explain this ambivalence, because we are all fascinated by, and also at the same time we are also afraid of great minds that when we are not of their own opinions. And it is the same with Newman, I think, whose admiration for the character of the gentleman, which is the exemplification of human intellectual excellence, does not prevent some kind of disapproval. Now, the section describing the gentleman concludes with an important specification. He says, "Such are some of the lineaments of the ethical character which the cultivated intellect will form apart from religious principle." So these traits are certainly good, but not good enough when compared with the fulfillment to which the Christian religion can lead human beings. So the portrait of the gentleman is a description of the excellence of human nature, the highest balance of knowledge and morality that humanity as such can reach without religion, without religious influence. The ambivalence of Newman mirrors the precarious nature of a purely naturalistic ideal of humanity when we consider this from a religious point of view. This ideal of humanity, the gentleman, can produce at the same time a saint but also an heretic, and both of them with the traits of a gentleman. So Newman admires or condemns this cultural ideal contingent upon whether it assists or distorts his own model of humanity. And even when he's critical, when Newman is critical of this model, he does not repudiate the model, but instead he goes kind of beyond that model. It is accordingly with no surprise or shock that after long pages of praise and admiration for the philosophical habit of mind, we confront Newman's dismissal of the role of moral philosophy in improving the moral standard of people. And when Newman needs to provide some examples of how liberal knowledge acts partly on the side of Christianity, and also partly against Christianity, he chose a few pages from an entry that he wrote from the Encyclopedia Metropolitana. It is an entry on Cicero that he wrote in 1824 when he was only 23 years old. Here, in this encyclopedia entry, Cicero, as all ancient pagans, is presented as an example of the failure of philosophy in providing a solid moral ground for existence. And it is in the context of discussing the limits of what Newman calls the religion of philosophy, which is the pretension of culture of making people better and becoming a sort of religion. It is in this context that Newman presents us with a memorable passage in which he openly defends the autonomy of knowledge from morality or utility, but also he disputes its incapacity, the incapacity of knowledge, to change man's conduct profoundly. It's a long passage, but despite of its length, the worth of the passage lies in its shrewd rendering of this topic that I'm addressing today. So Newman says, knowledge is one thing, virtue is another. Good sense is not conscience. Refinement is not humility, nor is largeness or justness of view faith. Philosophy, however enlightened, however profound, gives no command over the passions, the influential motives, no vivifying principle. Liberal education makes not the Christian, not the Catholic, but the gentleman. It is well to be a gentleman. It is well to have a cultivated intellect, a delicate taste, a candid, equitable, dispassionate mind, a noble and courteous bearing on the conduct of life. These are the connatural qualities of a large knowledge, and they are the objects of a university. I'm advocating, and I shall illustrate and insist upon them. But still, I repeat, they are no guarantee for sanctity or even for conscientiousness. They may attach to the man of the world, to the profligate, to the heartless. Pleasant, alas, and attractive as he shows when decked out in them. Taken by themselves, they do but seem to be what they are not. They look like virtue at the distance, but they are detected by close observers and on the long run. And hence, it is that they are properly accused of pretense and hypocrisy, not, I repeat, from their own fault, but because their professors and their admirers persist in taking them for what they are not, and are officious in arrogating for them a praise to which they have no claim. Quarry the granite rock with razor, or moor the vessel with a thread of silk. Then you might hope with such keen and delicate instrument as human knowledge and human reason to contend against those giants, the passion and the pride of man. This is probably my favorite passage in Newman. So the best that philosophy can do is to raise individuals to the level of their fellows, and in short, to make them gentlemen. In Newman's view, profit is not the measure of virtue. Nevertheless, it cannot be denied that the exercise of good habits is a source of benefits both for the performers of those habits, but also to society at large. Similarly, intellectual virtues are substantially goods inseparable from the social and political usefulness, even if this usefulness is not their main end. Social development has helped improve moral development, has helped, providing means to the cultivation of moral improvement. But they are, and they remain, means, and they are not ends. Their manner of use depends on the ethical character of man. The same activities, the same means, could spread errors, false conceptions, vice, when they are led by bad persons. As Newman clarifies in the preface of the idea of a university, if a university is a place of teaching universal knowledge, its object must be intellectual and not moral, in theory. Such is a university in its essence. But then, practically speaking, it cannot fulfill this object duly, Newman writes, without the church's assistance, which is necessary for its integrity. So while he has stated his belief in the theoretical autonomy of knowledge from morality, then he maintains that in practice, this link exists because we can't separate different kind of virtues. We can only do it in an abstract sense. Moreover, Newman was asked to establish in Ireland not a secular, but a Catholic university. As he states in the idea, the main interest of the Catholic hierarchy in Ireland was, he says, not science, art, professional skills, literature, discovery of knowledge, but some benefit or other to accrue by means of literature and science and to his own children. Not indeed their formation of any narrow or fantastic type as, for instance, that of an English gentleman might be called, but their exercise and growth in certain habits, both moral and intellectual. Sorry, this is the wrong. Yeah. And the pictures you're going to see on the screen are actually from University College in Dublin, where Newman established the Catholic University. So, in spite of Newman's claim that knowledge is distinct from utility and also distinct from moral, then Newman argues for their potential accord when he writes specifically about his Irish experience and Irish enterprise. And one of the aims of Newman's Dublin writing was precisely to demonstrate that the Church's interest in founding an educational institution does not pervert the nature of the university. Religiosity was a key element in his project. He is particularly explicit, for instance, in the first of the sermons that he preached in the university church, which is just beside that building. This is University Church. So preaching to young students, he said, I want the same roof to contain both the intellectual and moral discipline. Devotion is not a sort of finish given to the sciences, nor science is a sort of feather in the cap, if I may so express myself, an ornament or set off to devotion. I want the intellectual layman to be religious and the devout ecclesiastic to be intellectual. In the same sermon, Newman affirms that the separation of intellectual ability and talent from virtue is a great misfortune and a consequence of the fall of man. And this separation provokes confusion, disorder, and Newman Educational Project aims to integrate the entire person in all his faculties. And this is proper wisdom, this integration of the whole characteristics of the person. He said that he wanted his students to be oracles of wisdom and shrines of devotion. A Catholic university is a place for the integral formation, and the college, with its communal life under the direction of tutors, has a special role in the training of both intellectual but also moral traits of the individual character. And I believe some of the speakers later will focus on this particular topic. So Newman says, the university is for theology, medicine, law, medicine, for natural history, for physical science, for the science in general, and their promulgation. The college is for the formation of the character, intellectual and moral, for the cultivation of the mind, for the improvement of the individual, for the study of literature, for the classics and those rudimental sciences which strengthen and sharpen the intellect. We could say that the university is for knowledge and the college is for wisdom. And in Newman model, the two elements go together. Newman desires an education that is at the same time plainly liberal and clearly Catholic. He says, here I conceive is the object of the Holy See and the Catholic Church in setting up universities. It is to reunite things which were in the beginning joined together by God and have been put asunder by man. Some persons will say that I am thinking of confining, distorting, or stunting the growth of the intellect by ecclesiastical supervision. I have no such thought, nor I have any thought of compromise, as if religion must give up something and sign something. I wish the intellect to range with the utmost freedom and religion to enjoy an equal freedom, but what I am stipulating for is that they should be found in one and the same place and exemplified in the same persons. Nothing profitable will be lost to the true liberal mind, and additionally, religious influence and communal life in college will complete the formation of the whole person. So in conclusion, Newman views of the relationship between knowledge and morality work on a different hermeneutical levels. On a pure secular ground, he proposes their complete separation, because the direct end of a university is the teaching of universal knowledge. And so its aim is intellectual and not moral. But then a university has indirect ends, namely the elevation of the tone of society, Newman says, and the refinement of the individual. And in this respect, knowledge and morality can support each other. The highest balance of knowledge and morality that humanity can reach without religious principle is presented in his description of the gentleman. Newman does not repudiate this ideal, but he goes beyond this ideal. And it's only a university inspired by Christian faith, it is only there that the intellectual can be religious and the devout can be intellectual. And it's only there that students can be oracle of wisdom and shrines of devotion. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, profesor Angelo Bottone. Esta conferencia magnífica, bueno, ha planteado los conceptos, los términos que después se plantearán en la siguiente mesa ronda, ¿no? con esa confluencia entre lo moral, ¿no? Lo intelectual, lo espiritual, de acuerdo con un modelo de universidad integral y de un modelo también de hombre integral que, bueno, en la actualidad brilla por su ausencia y que además conecta, bueno, por lo menos en ciertas universidades, no en la que tenemos la actualidad entre manos, ¿no? Y algunas otras universidades que también forman parte de esa visión profunda católica que se une a la tradición fundacional de la institución universitaria, la universidad medieval, que la universidad no fue un invento de la Francia napoleónica, ¿no? Más bien su distorsión, sino brotó de las escuelas catedralicias y surgió en el siglo XI, ¿no? en la Edad Media, en plena Edad Media, ¿no? Obviamente, todo lo que plantea Newman requiere, pues, esa actualización, ¿no? Aquí también en la universidad, ¿no? En esta universidad fue fundada por el cardenal Herrera Oria, que, bueno, pues sigue en muchos aspectos una línea similar a la de Newman a la hora de fundar la universidad, formar caballeros, hombres, ¿no? Hoy también le diríamos damas, ¿no? Y de hecho hay un libro bastante amplio que compara las figuras del cardenal Ángel Herrera Oria con el cardenal Newman, que, bueno, desgraciadamente el autor falleció, si no hubiera estado en la mesa redonda, pero que, bueno, es sugerente. Tendremos 5 minutos de descanso para preparar la siguiente mesa. Muchas gracias.